When you check out at the pharmacy, you see the journey from idea to medicine, thanks to our intellectual property system, or IP for short. IP safeguards inventions, like a new way to prevent seizures or lower cholesterol. And IP supports competition from other brands, then lower cost generics, which are 90% of prescriptions filled in the US. Innovation, competition, lower costs, thanks to IP. Learn more at phrma.org/IP-works-wonders.
Your data is like gold to hackers, and they'll sell it to the highest bidder. Are you protected? McAfee helps shield you, blocking suspicious texts, malicious emails, and fraudulent websites. McAfee Secure VPN lets you browse safely, and its AI-powered text scam detector spots threats instantly. You'll also get up to $2 million of award-winning antivirus and identity theft protection, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Hello, B-Check listeners. This is Joe Freeman, senior writer from The Oregonian and Oregon Live, and your host today. When the Mount Bachelor ski resort abruptly went up for sale in August, a couple of Central Oregon mountain enthusiasts had an audacious thought. Maybe we should buy it. Before they knew it, the men, who had not met beforehand, put in motion a plan to purchase one of Oregon's most cherished landmarks. They organized a GoFundMe and formed a company. They hobnobbed with Oregon politicians. They sought out big pocket investors. They knew the challenge would be daunting. Bachelor is a coveted property, after all. So the corporate titans of the ski industry would be swarming, offering bids in the neighborhood of $200 million. But the movement was quickly hailed as a potential win for the underdog, drawing national attention for its effort to keep North America's seventh largest ski resort out of the hands of corporate America and in the hands of local ski bums. The group made a major announcement last week regarding their quest to buy Bachelor. Where do things stand, and how did we get to this point? Here to detail the latest and offer more on the intriguing backstory is Jonathan Bach, who covers housing and real estate for the Oregonian and Oregon Live. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining B-Check today.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe.
Yeah, I just found this story so interesting. There's so many fascinating layers. And so let's start off with quite literally the biggest component of the story, the Mount Bachelor. I'm not a ski or snowboarder, so I've never played on our Central Oregon treasure, but my understanding is that it's a unique resort, kind of a throwback, and kind of serves as a large economic driver for the area. Can you elaborate? Can you tell us more about the mountain and its importance to Central Oregon?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's important to sort of set the scene for why people love Bachelor in Central, not just Bend, but in Central Oregon generally. Mm-hmm. Dan Cochran, who's one of the two gentlemen who put together this group, Mountain Bachelor Community Inc., to try to put together investors to buy the mountain. He told me a story when we talked a few months ago about this. He's a snowboarder. Okay. This beautiful time 2 years ago when he went to Bachelor with a buddy, and he found just, the best, lightest, deepest powder that he'd ever ridden in his entire life. There'd been this overnight chill. Mm-hmm. And it was lightly populated that day. And so he told me it was us and about 25 of our new best friends that day on the mountain. So yes, the mountain can get really busy, but sometimes you find those moments that are just right. And not only is Bachelor a community hub, but it's a huge economic driver for the city. I want to pull up some stats here. It employed a little over 1,100 workers in 2024. Wow. Yeah. And that's according to one of the local economic development nonprofits, EDCO. It's not the region's largest employer, that's St. Charles, but it's definitely up there. So whoever buys Bachelor is going to hold the keys to Central Oregon's second largest private employer.
And this is like a long-standing, it's been around since the 50s, I want to say, this resort, and it kind of has always, originally was sort of a hidden treasure in the area, and then as, the winter sports, skiing and snowboarding took off, it kind
Right.
of evolved. And I've never been on the mountain. I've been in the area a million times since I've been in Oregon, but it's kind of unique in that there's over 4,000 acres of terrain, and it's owned by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's kind of open later than most resorts, often into May. So it's kind of a unique haven, I guess, for mountain enthusiasts. But who owns the mountain right now? And not the mountain, the resort, because
Right.
the mountain is owned by Oregon, right?
Yeah, so the owner of the ski resort right now is this company called Powder Corporation. They've owned it since the early 2000s. And the big news, as you alluded to earlier, is when this corporation, they're based in Utah, said that they were going to, last August, they were going to put it up for sale. So it was one of a few ski resorts that they were going to put up for sale. And they declined to say how much they wanted for it, but they had tapped JP Morgan Chase to lead this search for buyers. So once that happened, it was sort of like we were off to the races.
Yeah.
And that's when Dan Cochran, that snowboarder that I had mentioned earlier, and another person, Chris Porter, sort of met, and they thought, hey, let's try to find a community-driven way to gain ownership over this mountain, which is so vital to the Bend area.
Sure. And going back to the uniqueness of this resort, it's not like some place with this lavish kind of lodge and all that. Like there's free parking for people, which is unheard of in anything these days. And I think you still see people kind of camping in their vans in the parking lot occasionally, and it's from that standpoint, it's really got an old school kind of Bend vibe to it. I guess, is it common for corporate because I'm so naive about the situation. I just assumed some Oregon owned it, or an Oregon company owned it. Is it rare for these outside companies to own kind of all these properties? It seems like it's kind of, I guess it's taken over by corporate America like everything else.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of big players who like Powder, like another company, Vail. There are sort of these larger corporations that do have a handle on many of the nation's ski resorts. So that's what this small community group was a response to in many ways.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get into how, the meat of things. So Bachelor goes up for sale. The locals are stunned. It probably caught them off guard. Powder owns it, decided to sell. Like you said, JP Morgan Chase got involved, which kind of signals this is going to be a big kind of a deal, a lucrative big money situation. Dan and Chris, how did they meet? What's the origin for how they kind of put things together and lead us to how they started to kind of put things in motion?
Yeah. So I'm actually looking at the New York Times did a great story called "Revenge of the Ski Bums." I didn't get this anecdote from Dan and Chris, but the Times did. So basically, they had met online after one of them had put out the idea of Dan put out the idea online saying, I've got $20 and some old boards I can pitch in to effectively buy the mountain. And then Chris Porter, who was somebody who had also been a long time user of the mountain, he's a snowboarder, again, this is according to the Times story, basically responded and said, if anybody is serious about doing a feasibility study, I'm all in and would love to chat. And then it just, no pun intended, snowballed from there. They started gathering and this they did tell me, they started getting some professional advisors involved. They started looking at sort of potentials for registered securities. They did get some investors involved, started talking to investors, and they did get an outpouring of thousands of responses as they start getting media attention, both from us and others, to this idea of what would it look like for a community group to try to take over ownership of the mountain, especially in response to something that we talked about earlier, which was corporate ownership of the ski resort. Chris and Dan, when I talked to them, both had both cited some issues very politely, but somewhat adamantly, some maintenance issues on the mountain. I think with some of the lifts. So those are just things that they want to address on a rolling basis. They would like to have addressed on a rolling basis.
Okay, so there needed to be some sort of upgrades or updates.
Yeah.
And so they understood what they were getting themselves into. And, some might argue, and I'm sure they did, they know what the mountain needs and what it provides more than anybody else because they enjoy it. I assume on a monthly, if not weekly basis. They're regular attendees. So they kind of have an idea of the soul of the mountain, sort of a thing. And I guess, it seems to me that a big part of this story and a big part of their movement, why it gained so much attention, is it's kind of a David versus Goliath sort of a thing, for the lack of a better cliche. I guess, can you just speak to how rare it is? It must be unheard of for two random dudes to sort of, put this sort of a thing together to buy a ski resort. I just can't imagine that's very common.
Well, I haven't heard of two guys coming together to form, a group to put together a, sort of for lack of a better term, sort of an investment product to buy a mountain before, to buy a ski resort, I should say, before. Sure. That said, I think that, as we talked about earlier, it's a response to sort of the commodification of the mountain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what is the worry, or did they reveal any concerns about if some conglomerate came in to buy the resort? What are their concerns with what might happen? Did they share anything?
They didn't. I think they didn't share any specifics to my recollection.
Okay.
Off the top of my head. But I think what they want is, let me back up. What they would argue they bring is that specific insider local knowledge about what the mountain needs, what they see on the day-to-day as local users of the mountain. They know which ski lifts need the most maintenance. They know, which runs are, in need of the most maintenance. So I think that's what they would argue is their sort of benefit.
Right. I guess I wonder, just off the top of my head, like if someone comes in and they're looking to make more money, do they build a big lodge? Do they turn it into a Vail Junior or something like that? Because if I'm a company and I'm thinking about dollars, I see much more potential than this kind of throwback resort kind of offers. Yeah, so I don't know. I wonder if I guess from looking big picture, that would, if I was a local, that would kind of concern me. I don't know.
Right, especially during a change of guard. There's always uncertainty. When you've got a potential new owner coming in, what's going to happen? There's a certain safety in inertia.
Yeah. Well, and plus, like you said, over 1,100 jobs, what happens to these people's jobs, and what's the future that holds with that?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a development last week, which you broke. So what's the big news? What happened last week, and where do things stand?
Yeah, the big news, and I do want to give credit to Central Oregon Daily News. They did write up an initial story. But the Mount Bachelor Community Inc. did tell supporters in an email that they basically ran out of time to submit a formal bid. So they will not be buying the mountain, sadly for them. I talked to Chris Porter. He told me that they had sent a letter with a high net worth local backer and tried to make some other moves, but that they weren't able to effectively get a formal bid together. He said, we did everything we could to get a bid in. Now, one of the interesting things that I ran by Powder Corporation, that's the current owner who's selling it, Mount Bachelor Community Inc. had emailed supporters that it was unable to submit a bid due to timing constraints, but it also claimed that other bidders, quote, had a 5-month head start. So Powder disputed the characterization of that timeline. A spokesperson said, "No one had a head start. We announced publicly that we were putting the resort up for sale in August of 2024, and everyone expressing any interest in the resort was sent to JP Morgan Chase, who is running the process." So there's a little bit of a dispute around whether some of the other industry players may have had a little bit of a heads up ahead of time.
Sure.
Powder says that's not the case. This community group says that they might have had a little bit of a lag. The upshot at this point is that the community group wants to, and says that's in early talks with potentially another bidder or multiple bidders. I wasn't clear from my conversation with Chris if it was one or multiple, about doing some sort of joint venture in the future. And he didn't go into specifics, but doing a potential joint venture with Mount Bachelor Community Inc. To, again, partner on some of those same issues that we talked about and give a new buyer insight into what the mountain needs.
Oh, I see. So, they maybe wouldn't necessarily be co-owners, but they could almost be, affiliated with them in some way where they have an idea of what the mountain needs and help them kind of, put that together.
It's unclear at this point, because I asked him, so would that mean that, there could be a home for that money that you've raised? And he seemed to suggest that there might be, but again, it seems like it's so early that maybe there's a partnership to be done, maybe not. I think it's too early to tell.
Yeah. Well, not all fun stories and uplifting stories have happy endings, I guess. So I guess this one's not necessarily one of those, although they haven't totally closed the door on them being involved. And I assume we don't, people aren't usually at liberty from revealing how much money they've raised and such, but I assume they were keeping that close to the vest, and they haven't totally shared their plans for what they're going to do with however much money they have raised.
Yeah, so they did share a little bit. Porter told me that the group had secured investor pledges in the range of $100 million.
Wow.
Though no investor funds had traded hands, they said that they didn't want to put the cart before the horse. And that they had planned to raise some more money through a securities offering, but had not formally filed to do so yet. There was also a GoFundMe that was set up. And Chris Porter told me that they've only used it for the purposes of the MCBI. While they're still trying to move the ball forward on MCBI, they're going to retain those funds. If the effort just completely dies out, then they said that they would donate the money to a charity, ideally one that increases access to the mountain.
I probably should have asked you this a long time ago, but do these gentlemen have like a business background? Like, was that their job in their real lives? Do you know?
I actually don't know. I know that Dan is a real estate appraiser, and then Chris is a high school teacher.
Okay, so not exactly
a school teacher.
Gotcha. So not finance. They're not finance guys. With all this, I guess from someone just sitting on their couch reading this story, it's kind of impressive that these two passionate guys who love their community got so far, and you can dispute whether or not they had they were behind or the other people got a head start, but to kind of have this idea and to get as far as they did, I guess it was kind of impressive. What were kind of your thoughts on covering the story and seeing it kind of evolve over the course of the months?
As a business reporter, I am always interested in the business plan. And I was interested to see that, they did get a set of professional advisors pretty quickly on board to help with them with the registered securities part of that. That stuff can be really tricky. We cover other companies that deal with securities And, it can get really complicated for a multitude of reasons. And especially when you're dealing with investors. So I was, really interested to keep an eye on that part of it. And that's also why we wanted to understand how much they'd raised and what would happen with those funds, especially now that, they were not pursuing or not able to submit a bid, it sounded like. But more than that, I think the idea, and the Times story hit on this, and I think a lot of the stories hit on this as well, but the community aspect of this, this is a mountain that is extraordinarily important to the community as a whole, to Bend as a whole. The mayor of Bend, Melanie Keebler, told me a couple of months ago that it's really core to the city's identity. You don't even have to ski, but you probably know someone who works there.
So either you enjoy the mountain or it provides for your family at some level. And we're talking about small towns, and Bend is an emerging city that's growing seemingly every year. So it's not as small as it used to be, but by comparison, it's still a smaller area. Well, it's very fascinating. Is there anything else you want to add before I let you go, Jonathan?
No, I think we covered it.
All right. Well, this has been a fun conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining the show. If you're interested in reading Jonathan's coverage of this story, I'll drop links to the stories in the show notes, so check them out. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this episode, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to the Oregonian and Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, I'm Joe Freeman, and this was Beat Check.